So right at the end of Galatians, in chapter 6, verse 17, Paul says, "From now on, let no one make trouble for me, for I carry the marks of Jesus branded on my body." Now what he meant, I don't know, he might have meant that he'd got scars and wounds from suffering for Christ. It might have been a contrast with circumcision, that it wasn't the mark of circumcision that mattered, it was these marks of persecution that mattered. But what's kind of interesting is that the word is, he talks about these marks, they're stigmata. And so starting around the 13th century, when later Christians sometimes experienced stigmata, which is to say, having in their own bodies the wounds of Christ on their hands and feet and sides, in some sense there's always a reference back to Paul. Now, I don't think almost anybody thinks Paul actually had the stigmata in the later sense, but this is where the word comes from.
Well, I think Galatians is one of my very favourite books of the Bible, and possibly my favourite of the Pauline epistles. The reason for that is that I think he says in a very brief space the most radical things that he's got to say. And I think still to this day, people don't realise just how radical this really is.
Paul wrote this letter to the Galatian Christians. Now, they lived in Asia Minor, an area of Asia Minor which corresponds to modern Turkey. And in this letter, Paul gets very, very angry indeed.
Above all, this epistle is about freedom. And Paul is more or less saying to the whole human race, so far you've been in chains, so far you have been slaves. What I am saying to you sets you free to be human beings for the first time.
It's quite important in a number of ways. For one thing, you learn quite a lot about Paul's own history and Paul's sense of himself, and particularly he's very concerned to say, I'm an apostle in my own right. I don't derive my authority from Peter, from the other apostles. And you get this kind of complex argument that Paul goes through. It reminds me of when people get into really difficult arguments and they start debating who said what when, and no, I didn't say that then, that came before. And you have Paul saying, well, I never went to them until 4 years after I'd had my original revelation, and they didn't say this then, and then it was another 14 years before so-and-so. So quite a lot of concern about how he stands in relation to the other apostles.
What had happened is that Paul had preached the gospel in Galatia, and his message would be, you are saved by faith in Christ alone. Christ is sufficient for your salvation. And then, a bit later, he heard that they'd actually changed to what he called another gospel. If I could just read this bit here, Galatians 1 verse 6, Paul doesn't mince his words. He says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you, that's reference to God, in the grace of Christ, and are turning to a different gospel.
He also tells people for the first time this makes you equal as human beings. It doesn't matter what race you belong to, it doesn't matter what gender you belong to, it doesn't matter whether you're an adult or a child, it doesn't matter whether your social status is that of a free person or a slave. You are all fundamentally equal.
So people were saying that you have to keep the Jewish law, and part of the Jewish law was being circumcised. And so people were putting pressure on these Galatian Christians to be circumcised and to keep the Jewish law.
Do you need to be a Jew to be a Christian? Do you need to follow the law? Do you need to be circumcised? And Paul says, no. And in fact, Paul says very, very forcefully, no, you shouldn't. The people who've been telling you that you ought to get circumcised, they're wrong.
And when he says that so far you've been slaves, he's certainly linking that to the religions within which so far people have lived. Religions that impose upon people certain ritual duties, sacrificial duties, customary duties, and also certain sets of moral rules.
Now, this is probably why a lot of people especially Jewish people, will not like Galatians because it tends to be, well, people would say it's anti-law. It's actually more complex than that. Paul's point is that the law of Moses is actually God's law, and it's good and it's holy. But because human beings are sinful, this law can only condemn you.
But the most shocking, the most incredible thing, he says, is that Judaism is actually like this as well. Because insofar as it's bound to the law is also coming from this ambiguous, intermediate level. It comes from God, but it comes through these intermediate, demonic powers.
So for the very identity of what is Christianity, is it a new movement within Judaism? It could have been, but because of the way Paul argues, because of Paul's success in arguing in that way, Christianity becomes something independent.
For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. In some ways, he was saying certain things you do are indifferent. He was saying it doesn't matter whether you're circumcised or not circumcised. It doesn't matter whether you're following Jewish customs or not. And equally, he's saying it doesn't matter if you're a slave or a free, if you're married or not married. In fact, he says you should live as if the opposite were the case. So there's a certain sort of indifference, because I think he's saying that whatever position we're in, we can be playing a role, we can be playing our part.
So for example, in Galatians 3, verse 13, Paul writes, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, and he quotes here from Deuteronomy 21:23, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So let me just explain this a little bit more. He's saying, therefore, that this law of Moses can only be a curse for human beings because human beings are sinful. And then he goes on to say that actually Christ redeems us from the law because Christ became a curse for us. And there's a very, very striking passage in Deuteronomy 21:23 where it says that he who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. Now, okay, I'll just explain that. What would happen in the Old Testament is that somebody would be put to death by stoning, and then they'd hang them on a tree, and that person was accursed by God. Now, in the 1st century AD, this verse, Deuteronomy 21:23, was applied to the Roman punishment of crucifixion. And that's why sometimes in the New Testament you hear this, you hear Christ died on a tree, not on a cross. And so Paul is saying that when Christ was crucified, he was accursed by God, but he was accursed by God for our sake.
So on the one hand, this book is important about a debate that was going on in Paul's time, but then nearly 1,500 years later it becomes very important again, because Galatians is one of the central texts that's really important in the Reformation, at the time when the Western Christian church splits, divides amongst itself, at the time when Protestantism is formed. So for the founder of the Reformation, if you can call him that, for Martin Luther, Galatians is one of the key texts because it proclaims this thing that he takes to be absolutely central, which is that justification is by faith and not by works of the law.
Paul is often confronting people and saying, look, he's very, very concerned about, shall we say, doctrine, not just doctrine for its own sake, but he's very, very concerned that people believe that Jesus is the divine Son of God. He's very concerned that people understand something about the death of Christ and so on. And yeah, he's got this prickly nature. To be honest, he's not the sort of person I would invite for a dinner party. I mean, very, very interesting, but he's not exactly a very relaxed sort of person. And in fact, before he became a Christian, he was a Pharisee who was persecuting the church and trying to destroy it. So I think it's part of his genes, really, that he's got this rather angry nature.